Hello, and welcome to another episode of Ask a Pianist. My name is Andrew Aarons, and today I'd like to touch upon a subject which has been approached before, albeit obliquely. When it comes to emotions, and how these emotions may be generated in the listener by the pianist, there is a wide variety of thought from both instrumentalists and composers regarding how much or how little the performer should encourage or support this form of audience manipulation. Furthermore, there are established performance traditions, geographical, historical, and composer-based, that can inform us of what has been done in the past, what may be successful, and of course, what may be inappropriate or even overindulgent. So, on this episode of Ask a Pianist, I consider a question that is often asked of me by a student. How far should I go? Let's consider a piece that has the potential to be so overindulgent as to be rendered obscene. For the moment, I'll play it in a generic, middle-of-the-road interpretation that doesn't do too little or too much. This work by Ravel, which was later reworked into an orchestral piece, is absolutely loaded with musical moments that can be turned into emotional scenes. The first little phrase is beautifully constructed to play with and change our perception of what is happening. A lesser composer would probably have kept it in G major, like this. Ravel, however, turns the phrase on a dime, turning a relatively content major key phrase into something that dies at the end. There is an extra stab to the heart, of course, the appoggiatura F sharp that reinforces the pain of the drop. He continues this melodic struggle by starting the next part of the phrase on a long high ninth, which to the listener feels like it desperately needs to resolve. This then falls into a progression of seventh chords, which, due to their construction, never really seem to resolve. Not only has Ravel completely eliminated the G major hope of the opening phrase, he continually shifts back and forth between major and minor keys, always ending in a minor key and not in a major key. Here's what I mean. We start in major and end in minor. Happiness to sadness in its most basic form. Then there's a glimmer of hope. But it's struck down immediately, and it never recovers. As a last reinforcement of the idea of happiness turning to sadness, he gives us once again a glimmer of hope, but shuts it down without any doubt. Before we go any further, let's discuss the musical context and why we notice these changes from major to minor so clearly. In order to perceive change, we always need a frame of reference, and in order to perceive extreme change, we need a firmly established basis from which we can judge how far this extreme change deviates from the norm. The most powerful harmonic progression in tonal music is the dominant to tonic cadence. This tells us everything about the key. This is our firmly established base. This power extends to the deceptive cadence in a major key, dominant to submediant. We expect a return to the major home key, but instead end up in the relative minor. This major to minor situation is as extreme as we can get without altering the diatonic scheme. The emotional experience is simple. Happiness with an expectation of happiness that is turned to sadness as a surprise and without preparation. This whole first section relies upon this feature, that we expect something and get something else that is not only different from what we expect, but with an almost opposite emotional connection. But this brings up actually the issue that is at the core of how we experience this kind of music. That major keys seem to indicate to us music that is within the spectrum of happy, whereas minor keys indicate to us music in the spectrum of sad. In Western classical music, this is a universal concept, and though I think it's possible to argue against this tradition from an artistic point of view, I'm not aware of any example before the 20th century where this is not the case. Due to this, and the proliferation of this approach to keys and all other forms of Western music, I think as a performer, we are safe in assuming that the music that Ravel writes is intended to invoke these feelings in the audience that hears it. So, let's take it as an assumption that in its most basic form, major keys are happy and minor keys are sad. Considering what Ravel writes, what strategies can we use to show this shift from happy to sad to the audience? Well, first we usually have to figure out if the shift is supposed to be gradual or sudden. If we play this music following the score as written, does Ravel provide preparation for the shift? Clearly not. The shift will be sudden and unprepared. Next, we have to decide what we're actually shifting. In other words, how do we play something happy in this context? And how do we play something sad? When it comes to dynamics, it is a common occurrence to play happy themes louder than sad ones. And when it comes to sound quality, happy themes tend to be more percussive than sad ones. As an extreme example, I'll overdo the difference so you can hear it now. Timing is also a very important factor here. Happy themes tend to be more rhythmically square or regular, whereas sad ones tend to be more languid and more fluid. Here it is with only timing changes. These things, dynamics, sound quality, and timing, help us to tell the audience what is happening, and tell them in a way that we best see fit. We can tell the audience in a subtle way, by not making any of these issues extreme, like this. We can also make them extreme together, which really milks this situation for emotional content. This is where the question comes up. How much should I do? This fundamental question really boils down to a simple issue. Do we want to tell the audience how to feel at a given moment, or do we want to give the audience reasonably neutral material upon which they can imprint their own feelings? Think about that for a second. If we play this piece with emotions flowing everywhere from one extreme to another, there exists a power to sweep the listener along, as if emotions were a tidal wave. Sometimes the music absolutely requires this, and it's a wonderful thing to be in a concert and feel at once overwhelmed by emotions that not only seem natural to the listener, but are amplified to a point that is beyond anything they would normally experience in their daily life. On the other hand, if we play this piece in an unemotional way, where the events occur but are not specified, the audience has the chance to imprint their own interpretation of what these harmonies and gestures mean. The listener uses their own past experiences as a filter and amplifier to the music being played, and in a sense, this allows a greater variety of internal interpretation to occur. This approach also has significant benefits. The most obvious being that without pinning down the definition of what is happening emotionally, there will be more persons who can be moved by this kind of interpretation than if the pianist made the choice for them. Let's look at these two extremes for a moment. I'll play the opening in a way where I will tell you how you should feel. By declaring every change, I'm essentially becoming a part of the music, a character within the movie, rather than just being the projector. This synthesis of performer and music is definitely a feature of romantic music. Liszt, of course, comes to mind. In order for this to work, as a performer, you have to make sure that every emotional event is planned and measured so that the overall structure of the work is not damaged but enhanced. Consider, the first statement has to be slightly less than the second. If we do too much at the beginning and not enough as we go along, the emotional balance is off entirely. This approach applies to the greater whole as well. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that our plan is to increase the emotional charge of each phrase as we go along in the piece. This would mean that each subsequent reiteration of the main theme would have to be more than the previous. The first would be reasonable. The second would have a bit more to it. And the third would be just devastating. The middle sections are also built on the idea of themes repeating more than once. Again, if we go the route of emotionally declaring everything, then we have to measure it accordingly to enhance the structure. This theme will be rather neutral on the first play. but the second time it comes in, it'll be much more exaggerated. When an audience hears something for the second time, they will find it uninteresting if it is exactly the same as when they heard it the first time. This is why we tend to be more exaggerated when a theme returns in a piece. In addition, when an audience has heard something before, they tend to be more receptive to us pushing the boundaries of taste. Proponents of this approach recognize the power that one can have over an audience if this kind of emotional manipulation is well crafted. Let's not forget, too, that if a listener is of the belief that music is a primarily emotional experience first and an intellectual one second, then the approach of declaring to an audience what is happening emotionally is the ideal for this listener. Anything less results in the opinion that the performer is cold-hearted or not in touch with the emotional content of the piece. It's a point of view based on what the listener expects to get out of a performance. Furthermore, this approach is very successful if one is presenting music that an audience does not know. On a first listen, people will understand more of the piece if we simply tell them what is happening, rather than hinting and letting them guess for themselves. Let's consider the other extreme, where we present the music in a neutral way that encourages the audience to imprint their own interpretation on the material. First off, the internal emotional moments that happen in each phrase are played straight, with no changes to rubato or timing, and very subtle changes to sound quality and dynamic. This approach is applied to each subsequent variation on the theme, and this means that the audience is forced into noticing the changes of distribution and voicing, and also to take into account the greater structural purpose of each statement. In other words, the audience is forced into seeing the piece as a long whole rather than a series of emotional events. Consider the differences in these themes. Without the distraction of emotional moments, we notice the differences. The perception of the second section also changes with this approach. One thing that is always absent when emotional moments are at a peak is the perception of a background atmosphere that the pianist is trying to create. We have so many distractions to the ear that we can't tell what the surrounding area is like. With no rubato, and changes made only on the level of sound quality and voicing, we get a beautiful form of stasis and tranquility in this section. Notice, too, how our ears fill in the gap of emotion that may be missing. The theme gets really charged at the beginning of each bar. Instead of making it explicit by taking time like this, we can almost hear it and imagine what we've heard with those stresses in place. This is where the strength of this approach appears. The perception of long structure in romantic music is probably the hardest thing to convey to an audience. Any time we spend on beautifying a moment or communicating an emotional event risks pulling the structure apart. By taking the neutral, emotionless approach, we guarantee that this risk does not exist. And furthermore, we can point out to the audience other factors like background atmosphere to them that they'd probably not notice if we used the opposite approach. Proponents of this approach recognize that there is a significant power in presenting music to an audience where the performer actually blends in and disappears with the music being presented. The illusion being that the audience hears Ravel instead of hearing Andrew playing Ravel. Instead of telling the audience how to feel at specific moments, we're actually inviting them to feel however they want given the material at hand. Some audiences prefer this, especially if they're very familiar with the piece, and if any interpretational choice by the pianist would conflict with their already preformed memories of how the piece should go. One of the most dangerous things that can happen when we're playing with emotions of any sort is what I like to term as falling into the piece. That we get swept up in the emotions of the work that we're playing to a point where the interpretation itself falters. Consider, if I were to play this middle section, enjoying every emotional moment I can in a selfish way, I'd probably play something like this. I love these harmonies. I really do. I love the feeling I get, the experiences I get when I hear this from my own two hands. I would linger on these chords forever if I could. But this is purely selfish. It does nothing for the piece, and for anyone who is listening. It sounds pretty odd. Even the opening melody can be torn apart in this way, with the pianist feeling everything as they play. This is an extreme hazard in this kind of music, not only because it ignores other aspects of the piece, but because of a very simple truth. Just because we feel something from a piece does not mean that other people feel the same thing. The choice in what approach to take depends on many factors, and sometimes it can change on the day of a performance. Our choice in how far to indulge with emotional content is a direct extension of our own concept of musical taste and what is appropriate for a style or composer. This is why there is so much deviation in performances. One thing to keep in mind, however, and I think this is perhaps the most important thing, as performers, our task is to communicate the music, but not actively be moved by the music as we perform. We have to maintain an intellectual distance in order to make sure that all our practice and preparation result in a performance that is balanced and not impaired by selfish desires. I can't tell you how to play this piece. What I can say is that you have to weigh and balance the benefits of both approaches and determine for yourself which approach you think is the most effective for your audience, your hall, and even your piano. So, that's it for this episode of Ask a Pianist. Until next time, keep practicing and experiment for yourself with how much you indulge in the emotional content of a piece. By going an opposite route, you may find a more successful interpretation. Bye for now.